Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 37 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Happy listening. The first thing Janir noticed was her headache. An intense, piercing headache that throbbed with each beat of her heart. Next, that she was slung across the front of a saddle. The saddle pommel dug into her stomach with each bobbing stride of the horse. Her hands were tied in front of her, dangling limply. All the blood seemed to have settled in her skull, making her head feel swollen. At least it was another cloudy day, and she wasn't having to face the sunlight. 3 other horses' hoofbeats on rocks echoed those of the horse she was on. A boot, a man's boot in a stirrup, rested at the corner of her sight. Cerilius must have slung her across his horse's saddle. The Argetallams had succeeded. They had gotten her past the guards at the entrance to the Crichton Road in the middle of the night, and now they must be trekking towards Slavin, where they would be back in their allies' territory. After that, Janir shivered at the thought. What could the Lord Argetallam want with her? She wasn't certain, but it seemed he wanted her alive. That could hardly be good. She stayed still, trying not to let Cerilius know she was awake. There were the buckles to the horse's saddle, in plain sight and within her reach. Janir gradually stretched, careful not to alert Cerilius. Struggling against the leather cords around her wrists, Janir caught the ends of the straps and tugged as hard as she could without rousing suspicion. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the buckles finally worked loose, and Janir managed to unfasten the girth. She wasted no time. Janir arched her back, jerking the saddle off balance, and the entire saddle, along with her and Cerilius, crashed to the ground. Cerilius shouted in surprise, and the horse whinnied, sidestepping in confusion. They landed on the gravel, Cerilius sideways and Janir feet first. Cerilius dove for her straight away, but Janir was faster. She snatched up a rock, and even though her wrists were still bound, smashed it into the side of Cerilius's head with all the force she could muster. He cried out and fell to the ground, clutching his left eye, cursing incoherently. Her hands still tied together, Janir dashed around Cerilius as fast as she could, but her legs wobbled and the gravel slid treacherously under her feet. Her head spun, and Janir stumbled into the unforgiving rocks. She ignored her scrapes and bruises and leapt to her feet again, racing in the direction they had come. "Get her!" Cerilius snarled, still clutching the side of his head. Amilla didn't say anything, but spurred her horse after Janir. Janir scrambled as fast as she could, but she was no match for the horse's speed. The animal's shoulder slammed into her back and sent Janir sprawling into the gravel. Janir rolled over with a jarred and unsteady feeling, the wind knocked out of her. She inhaled slowly, trying to catch her breath. They were in a gorge of some sort, but wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other. Smooth gray rock rose high above their heads on either side to form solid walls that guided them along the road. Amilla swung down from her horse and strategically positioned herself to block Janir from running. "Cerilius, are you all right?" "That Bratchett nearly got my eye," Cerilius snapped. His hand came away from his head, and on his brow bone was a nasty line of mangled skin, oozing scarlet. "Well, it looks like you finally got some facial scars." "I said that jokingly," Cerilius growled. "So did I." Amilla chuckled to herself at some private joke. Cerilius marched toward Janir. "Bring one of the spare horses. We'll put her on that." Amilla tilted her head sideways. "Wasn't that what I suggested back in Brevia?" Cerilius grumbled. "We didn't have enough rope to secure her to the horse at the speeds we were moving." Janir eased herself upright and held her face in her hands. The Argetallams had marched into the castle and just grabbed her. They had done it easily, and now they were keeping her captive. All of her resistance was pitifully futile. How could she possibly escape them? Cerilius dragged her to her feet and shoved her in the direction of the spare horse. Amilla stopped the animal a few paces away and tightened the girth before she nodded to Cerilius. While Amilla held the horse's reins, Cerilius hefted Janir onto its back. Janir kicked the animal in the ribs, making it shy away, but Cerilius was undeterred as he forced her up and untied her hands. The moment her hands were free, Janir slapped and clawed at Cerilius, going for the already damaged flesh just above his left eye. He snarled as her fingernails raked across the tender wound, and he slapped her in retaliation. Tears sprang to her eyes, and Janir felt the impact all through her skull and neck. While she was still recovering from his strike, Cerilius retied her wrists to the pommel of the saddle as tightly and securely as he could without cutting off the blood to her hands. "Well," Cerilius sighed once Janir was again bound, "we should be moving." He took the reins of her horse, lashing them to the saddle of his own. Janir had heard stories about frost griffins, one of the more aggressive species of griffin. As Cerilius and Amilla mounted their horses and urged them on again, Janir looked up. The stone walls on either side of the road rose about 4 or 5 sword lengths high. Above that, the high peaks of snow-cloaked mountains ascended to the heavens. Janir wondered how she hadn't noticed the cold in the air before. Perhaps because there was no wind, not even the faintest breath of a breeze. All the same, she hugged her arms against her sides, wishing that she had a cloak. No, she wished she was back home in her room, by the fire. Fire reminded her of how Ernick had found her, and that made her feel like an idiot. If only she had suffered in the cold last night, and then Ernick wouldn't have been able to find her, and the Brevians would have had the entrance to the Crichton Road too heavily guarded for the Argetallams to slip through. Then she wouldn't have had to suffer all the bruises and scrapes the other 2 Argetallams had given her, and whatever the Lord Argetallam had planned. Janir shuddered at the thought of the Lord Argetallam. Ever since she had been little, she had had nightmares about him until she wasn't sure how much was memory and how much was imagination. He had become a distant and insubstantial fear, like the thought of fire mountains or bottomless caves in the ocean. The Argetallams briefly stopped twice during the day and then pressed on. Soon, Janir stopped fighting them at every turn. She didn't see that it was gaining her anything besides bruises. Amilla and Cerilius never spoke, save to one another, and then they talked as if Janir wasn't even there. "Negotiations with the Zamarza woman should be completed sometime by the end of next week," Cerilius commented, almost to himself. The silence had been unbroken for a while. The only sounds had been the crunching of the horse's hooves on the gravel, and the creak of leather as the saddles shifted. "About time," Amilla muttered. "If there weren't so many bloody incantations that had to be learned for the spell, the Lord Argetallam would have just claimed the Bratchett's powers and done the work himself." Janir had never heard of Zamarza, but this didn't sound good for Brevia. Argetallams working with an enchantress? Although we could just beat them out of her, Amilla added. "True, but enchantresses of the 8th degree are so rare these days. Even the Lord Argetallam is hesitant to damage this one." "A curious payment she demanded, wasn't it?" Amilla conversationally continued. "She could have demanded any number of artifacts in the Slavish enchanter temple, and they most likely would have given them to her, but no. Zamarza may be one of the more powerful spellcasters in the world today, but she is a functioning madwoman. You can't expect her to be sensible," Cerilius answered. What was this about? Janir silently screamed. Normally, Argetallams were more involved in destroying the enemy's magical weapons than the creation of their own. But Cerilius and Amilla ended the conversation at that, and if Janir asked any questions, they wouldn't be answered. She had already tried. She couldn't help remember that the Argetallams had wanted the key of Amatons for a sorcerer. Could it have been this Zamarza? But the diviner had said a man wanted the key, right? It finally started to snow that evening. Flakes fluttered down like tiny tufts of white fur and settled to the ground in patches. Shortly after the flakes began to fall, a low but broad entrance to a cave came into view around a bend. They had been passing places like it every hour or so, and Janir guessed they were for travelers to seek shelter from the elements and, at night, from the frost griffins. Amilla and Cerilius dismounted and led the horses under the rugged entrance. Janir ducked to keep from hitting her head. Inside, a domed ceiling of stone stretched over the top of a chamber large enough that a whole caravan could have sought shelter within. One side had stone troughs and iron rings in the wall for animals, and the other was flat with stacked firewood along its length. The two sides were divided by a waist-high stone barrier that had gaps in it every few sword lengths, just broad enough for a person to squeeze through. There was the smell of damp earth and damp stone. A faint trickle of water dripped from a spout in the shape of a grotesque face in one of the corners, and the water pooled in a large stone basin on the ground below it. There were black patches where someone else had recently been here and built fires, and the ground was covered in the imprints of mortal-sized footprints, dwarf-sized footprints, and horse hoof prints in the animal side. Cerilius handed his horse's reins to Amilla and turned his attention to Janir. "Listen, girl," he sternly began. "You know you can't defeat either Mortana Amilla or me. It's getting dark out there, and even if you escaped, you would have to face frost griffins. Now, the Lord Argetallam ordered us to bring you as undamaged as possible, so I would rather not have to give you another bruise. But if you try anything, you will get one. Do you understand?" Janir bit her lip. He was right, and that was the most painful part of it. She nodded stiffly. Cerilius untied the thongs binding her wrists to the saddle. "Now, slide off this way, and mind what I said." Discouraged, Janir sighed and obeyed. She slid off the horse to the ground, quietly and without making a pass at Cerilius's nose or the wound she had already given him. He handed her off to Amilla while he untacked and fed the horses grain from the saddlebags, then went to work building a fire on the other side of the stone barrier. Janir hated relying on her captors for everything. When she had been her brother's captive, she had hated that too. But then Lucan had at least allowed her some privacy. He had Carlisle, so he could let her out of his sight so long as he kept the enchanter and made it clear that the enchanter would die if she didn't return. Now, either Amilla or Cerilius was always with her. Though Amilla was the one who watched her while she attended her business, a fact Janir reasoned she should be grateful for. Shortly after, Amilla dragged her by the arm to a place close enough to the fire that she could feel its warmth, but not so close that she could try to pick up one of the rocks that had been placed around it or try to use one of the logs as a weapon. Amilla tied Janir's hands together again and bound her to a ring on the low rock barrier. Then Amilla went to sit closer to the fire along with Cerilius. The two discussed if one of them should take watch. They debated it for some minutes before they decided that anyone brave enough to be sneaking through Frost Griffin territory after dark deserves to catch us. The fact that Amilla and Cerilius had both been up all night and riding all day most likely influenced their decision more than either of them would have liked to admit. The two Argetallams shared dried meat and hard bread from their saddlebags. They gave Janir a strip of meat and a biscuit. The dried meat was as tough as shoe leather, and probably tasted the same. As for the biscuit, Janir thought it must be the flavor and texture of soapstone, but she was desperately hungry and ate it all the same. Cerilius draped a spare fur mantle that had probably belonged to Ernic over Janir before he and Amilla slid into their bedrolls, using the saddlebags of their horses as pillows. Janir listened to their breathing become even and regular. She shifted position on the hard ground and tried to make herself comfortable. She had thought she was done with being a prisoner. Now, here she was. Spontaneously, Janir attacked the rope around her wrists. She tried to yank herself free, but that didn't do any good. She tried to coax the knots loose, but Amilla had tied them well, and Janir had made them tighter with all her yanking. Janir even tried chewing them, but that didn't do any good either. She struggled with her bonds for another moment before giving up. Something odd, like a flicker of magic, glimmered at the edge of her consciousness, but she was too tired to ponder it. She only knew it wasn't Seovan. Janir leaned her head against the stone and closed her eyes. Surely her absence had been noticed by now. It would have been noticed at dawn, if not sooner. So where was Seovan? Could he have been killed in a fight with Amilla and Cerilius while Janir was unconscious? No. Seovan could hold his own in battle, and even though Amilla and Cerilius probably would at least hurt him badly, he would have hurt them right back. Neither one had any injuries. That meant he was coming. He had come the last time. But then he had been taken captive too, Janir reminded herself. But this time would be different, she insisted. It would have to be, or else... Better to not start speculating. Psst, Janir. Janir bolted upright to see a bedraggled Carlisle peering over the top of the stone barrier. Her heart skipped a beat. Seovan would be with him. Carlisle's robe and hair were dusted with snowflakes. His cheeks, ears, and nose were cherry red from the cold. Cerilius, or maybe it was Amilla, stirred in their bedroll. Janir held a silencing finger to her lips until the normal rhythms of their slumbering breath could be heard. She stretched out, reaching with her power, but couldn't find the dappled light of an elf. "Where is Seovan?" Janir whispered in the quietest voice she could manage. She tried reaching out for him, but to no avail. "Cut off. Your lovely kin caused a rock slide back there. I was already following them, so I was able to get through before it fell." "Where were you?" Janir demanded. "I fell asleep, and when I woke up you were gone, and the spy was there." "Oh." Carlisle said the word as if that explained something. "Well, I heard the call of nature, you see, and everything seemed fine, and I was going to be right back, but I'm sorry." Janir sighed, a shallow, muted sigh. They would have just killed you anyway. It occurred to her that if they found him now, they would do the same thing. "Help me out of here?" Carlisle nodded and slipped around the stone barrier to kneel at her side. "Why didn't you find Seovan and just tell him instead of dashing after me yourself?" "I couldn't find him. By the time I came back, the guards had already caught the spy, and Goblin was off interrogating him, and they were getting away," Carlisle hissed back. That meant that Cerilius and Amilla had had an even greater head start than she thought. She planned to keep questioning Carlisle in a moment. The enchanter didn't have any more luck working the knots loose than she had. Finally, he glanced around. He espied the hilt of Cerilius's large hunting knife protruding from the saddlebags the Argetallams warrior was using as a pillow. Carlisle glanced to Janir and shrugged. "Be careful," Janir whispered. Carlisle waved her off and tiptoed to Cerilius's head. He grasped the hilt and eased the blade out of its sheath. Janir began to have second thoughts. Maybe she should have told Carlisle to just leave. Run while he could. He could die trying to free her, but it was too late now. The knife made the faintest of rasping sounds as Carlisle drew it. Cerilius stirred in his sleep and Carlisle froze. Janir knew how bad it would look if Cerilius or Amilla woke up now. Carlisle, standing over Cerilius with a hunting knife that could have decapitated a bull. She held her breath and prayed that Cerilius wouldn't wake up. Cerilius rolled onto his side and laid still. Carlisle crept back to Janir and knelt in front of her. "Be careful," Janir repeated as the enchanter angled the blade to cut through her bonds. Carlisle sliced through the leather cord with small sawing motions, and Janir broke free. She stiffly rose to her feet, her muscles cramped from staying in one position too long. They could try and end Amilla and Cerilius. While the other two Argetallams were asleep, Janir and Carlisle might be able to... Janir discarded the idea. It made her feel sick inside just thinking about it. Killing men who were attacking her still bothered Janir. How could she justify 2 people who were sleeping? But the alternative was hiking back to Brevia on foot, through Frostgriffin territory. They couldn't risk taking one of the horses. Or could they? Janir glanced at the quad of lean, long-limbed horses, standing with pricked ears, intently watching every move of her and Carlisle. Chances were that it would be safest to take the horse she had been riding all along. Who knew if Amilla and Cerilius might have their horses specially trained or conditioned? Kalbo wouldn't have abandoned her. That attachment between human and animal might not necessarily be a result of her powers. Plenty of ordinary people had developed similar bonds. All the same, she didn't want to risk it. Janir quietly picked up the fur mantle and beckoned for Carlisle to follow. She crept around the stone barrier to the other side and quietly unlashed the horse's lead rope from the iron rings in the wall. "Leave that here," Janir whispered, motioning to the hunting knife Carlisle was still holding. He blinked at her as if she had just said something incredibly stupid. "We can't get the sheath for it, and I don't want that naked blade behind me while we're riding." Carlisle heaved a sigh and placed it on the ground, where the horses wouldn't step on it by accident. A muffled groan came from one of the two Argetallams. Probably Amilla, as she turned over in her bedroll. Instead of pausing, Janir moved faster. She wouldn't be able to saddle the horse. That would make too much noise. Instead, she tied the ends of the lead rope to either side of the horse's halter and swung it over the animal's head. The horse blinked its large, soft brown eyes at her. Janir silently patted the animal's glossy coat and coaxed it toward the entrance of the cave. The steed's hooves made dull grating sounds on the dusty stone. Janir gratefully realized that the animal was without the iron shoes that most horses wore. The animal nickered anxiously, leaving his companions in the safety of the cave. The further they went from the fire, the more Janir noticed the cold. They slipped outside and around the corner, so they wouldn't be visible to someone within the cave. There was no wind, but snowflakes drifted down in a thick and steady swirl of white. Janir looked up to nothing but a dark blue fog, spanning above them as far as she could see. They had to leave her carcatan behind, Janir realized. She didn't know where they were, and she couldn't go back and rummage through the other Argetallams' luggage. Reluctantly accepting the fact, Janir grabbed a handful of the horse's sorrel mane and clambered aboard. "If you mess this one up..." She sighed and didn't finish her sentence. Janir dutifully lowered an arm for Carlisle. He took it and sprang up behind her with minimal noise. "Hang on tight." Janir kicked the horse into a brisk walk. She waited to ask the rest of her questions until the entrance to the cave disappeared behind them into the white fog of snowflakes. "How did Amilla and Cerilius get past the guards at the mouth of the road? And why didn't you get their help?" "Oh, there weren't that many. The Argetallams slipped past them by riding up higher along the mountain, and then going down once they were past them. It was incredible, really. Extremely dangerous, but apparently worth it. There were only 4 horses, and the weather helped last night. We got snow." So why didn't you get the guards' help?" Carlisle bristled with indignation. "I tried to tell them, but the ones at the road hadn't even been told about the spy yet, and none of them believed me when I said that you had been kidnapped, even though I really tried and wasted a whole 10 minutes trying to convince them before I just ran after you myself." He blurted in a single breath. "All right," Janir said, placating. "I'm sure you tried." "My reputation must be proliferating." Carlisle sniffled. Janir restrained a bark of laughter. "Thank you for coming for me, Carlisle." Carlisle was quiet behind her for a moment, then he drew a breath to speak. Janir kicked the horse into a smooth canter before he could. Puffs of cloudy steam swirled around her face and rose from the horse with each breath. They pressed on, sailing through the murkiness of the snowy night like a ship through a fog. Janir could only see about 20 paces ahead of them before the world dissolved into a dark mist. They pressed on, only the horses' hooves rhythmically on the gravel, and their breathing to break the eerie stillness. You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.